Hey everyone, Eliza Kingsford here. I'm a licensed psychotherapist and mind-body practitioner. I help people stop restrictive dieting and lose weight. I work with people who are struggling with their body image and their weight and help them overcome their challenges permanently using non-diet and non-restrictive techniques. So I'm really excited to be here with you today. I love Kion. I love Kion products. I use them myself and I drink Kion coffee every morning. So I was really excited when Kion asked me to come help support you all during the fasting challenge. I am doing the fasting challenge myself. I actually regularly use intermittent fasting in my practice. I find that for me personally, it has beneficial effects. I know that there will be some other information for you all about specifically intermittent fasting for women. So if you are a woman, make sure you tune into that. But today I want to talk a little bit about fasting and mental health. If you do a quick cursory glance on the internet, you can find some pretty significant critiques of fasting as it pertains to mental health. Now, you can also find that there is good evidence and research to support some positive benefits of fasting for your mental health, decreased rates of self-reported anxiety and depression, and increased mood and quality of life. You can find some of those statistics as well. However, one of the biggest critiques of fasting that I want to address today is that fasting has been lumped in, and a lot of these critiques come from the eating disorder community, but lumped in with negative behaviors, obsessive behaviors when it comes to tracking your food and caloric intake. And some of the key points that these critiques will point out are things like fasting has been shown to cause binge eating or overeating. And it's really important to me as a mental health provider that we help tease out what some of these studies are showing and really point you back to yourself as a unique individual and help you understand what is going to work for you individually. So first, let me say that it is never the tool itself that we are using, but our relationship to the tool that's the most important. So I'll use a different example for this. The scale, for instance, many people I work with are using the scale as an indicator of their progress one way or another to see how their weight fluctuates, etc. And it's not the scale in and of itself that can be a positive or negative tool. It's the person's individual relationship to the tool or individual perception of the tool that ends up making it feel positive or negative. So you can step on the scale and feel empowered, like you have accountability, like you're understanding your data and the way that your body fluctuates from day to day. And the scale can be a positive tool for you. You can also step on the scale and it can trigger anxiety, fear, negative emotions, obsessive thoughts about your weight, obsessive thoughts about your body. It's not the scale that is producing those emotions. It's your relationship to it. So the same is true about fasting. It's not that fasting causes a negative or unhealthy relationship with food. It's that you are going to bring in your own individual relationship with it first. And if you have a tendency towards a negative relationship with food or your body, fasting could exacerbate that. It's not fasting itself. Fasting did not cause that relationship. However, it could trigger a negative emotion if that is already present within you. So one of the things you want to do first before you start a new tool or technique is to think about your relationship to food and your body. When I read the critiques about fasting and they say things like fasting can lead to orthorexia, which is an unhealthy obsession with eating healthy or quote clean foods. Again, we have to examine that it's not the fasting that led to that. It was your relationship with food and your body to begin with, and then the tool may have exacerbated it. Now, again, that's not to lay blame to the individual and say that there is something wrong with having those negative feelings or emotions. In fact, you may need or want some support around that. However, we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak, and say that it was fasting that caused that, because two individuals with very different relationships to food in their body are going to have a very different experience with that tool, in this case, fasting, depending on what they bring to the table. Another critique that I've heard about fasting that I want to address and hopefully sort of lay to rest for you all is that fasting causes binging or overeating. Along with addressing this statement, I need to make the distinction between deprivation and restriction and an intentional focus on not overeating. So, when we introduce deprivation and restriction to our bodies, in other words, when you have a focus to deprive your body of calories for the purpose of weight loss, when you have the focus of restricting the number of calories you're eating in an effort to lose weight, your body will have a metabolic adaptation on its own to try and get you to consume more calories so that it fights against deprivation. On its own, it has a metabolic adaptation to fight that deprivation. However, that is very different. The mindset of restriction and deprivation, notice I said mindset, that's very important. The mindset of restriction and deprivation should not be confused with the mindset of intentionally wanting to not overconsume or overeat calories. So many people, especially that I work with, struggle with an overconsumption of calories, that they're perhaps eating too often throughout the day. They find themselves eating at times that are not serving them, and there is an unintentional overeating of calories. When we try to reduce the unintentional overeating, that is not automatically restriction and deprivation. When we are trying to reduce the overeating and to funnel our calories into an eating window that might be shorter, but still eating an appropriate number of calories for our bodies, that will not trigger the metabolic adaptation of trying to get you to eat more because your body feels like it's in starvation. Let me try and say that one more time, a little bit less complicated. If you go in with the mindset of, I want to eat an appropriate number of calories for my body in a shortened window of time, that's a very different mindset than fasting is a way for me to restrict or reduce or deprive my body of calories so that I eat less and therefore lose weight. Those two different mindsets are going to produce a very different metabolic adaptation in the body. The restriction and deprivation mindset will trigger the body into starvation mode, and there will be a metabolic adaptation triggering you to perhaps binge or overeat. The appropriate number of calories for my body mindset will not trigger that same metabolic adaptation. Now, in this case, we're talking about intermittent fasting because we're talking about a shorter eating window within one day. Longer periods of fasting may trigger a metabolic adaptation of desiring more food. And in this case, the best thing that you can do for yourself, not only from a mental health perspective, but also getting the most physical benefits of fasting, is to become the observer of your food intake. And one of the things I recommend everybody does during the fasting challenge is to start to become the observer of your relationship to food. So whatever type of fasting you decide to try, whether that be intermittent fasting or whether you're doing a longer fast, try to step back and observe your relationship during that time. As a side note, I did a longer fast earlier this year, and I noticed very quickly the psychological impact of reducing my food intake. it heightened the awareness of all of the other food around me, because from a psychological perspective, I knew that I was choosing not to eat food. And so therefore, it heightened the presence of that food. Not only did it heighten the presence of that food, but it heightened the desirability of that food. Just because you have a heightened desirability for food doesn't automatically mean that you A, have to eat it, or B, even want to. When we decide not to eat something, the psychology will often come in and make that thing more desirable. It's like when you tell a child that the one toy they can't play with is this one. They can play with any other toys, but they can't play with this one. The psychology of that for the child goes directly to that toy, and they become preoccupied with it. Just because you have a preoccupation with something doesn't necessarily mean that there's something wrong with you or that it's a negative thing. You do not have to follow those thoughts down the rabbit hole. When I ask you to become the observer and observe your relationship, you can do things like step outside the thought and say something like, oh, how interesting. All of the sudden, I'm wanting more chocolate than I did before. That's so interesting. Instead of saying, I want chocolate, I'm craving chocolate, I'm craving chocolate. If you step outside yourself and become the observer, now you can start to watch your relationship and how it shifts and changes over this challenge over the next few days, and start to understand your relationship to food a little better. So if I were to give you any advice as you step into this challenge, number one, evaluate your individual relationship to food. When you think about fasting, does it bring up fear, anxiety, guilt, shame, or negative emotions? You want to evaluate whether or not fasting is going to exacerbate those for you. Don't believe everything you read, and don't automatically assume that just because some people are triggered by that tool, that means that you're automatically triggered by it as well. And number two, become the observer of your relationship while you're going through this challenge. Do you suddenly find your desire for certain foods heightened? Do you find that you are more hungry throughout the day? Do you find that you have a strong urge to overeat at certain points of the day? This is a very important point. Just because you have those urges doesn't automatically mean that you need to give in to them. So if you're going into it with the mindset that I recommend everybody go into it with, which is that you're still eating an appropriate number of calories for your body, you're just doing it in a different time frame. If you go into it with that mindset, you can start to observe the way that your body is triggering you to eat more, and say things like that. Say things like, I know I am getting an appropriate amount of food. How interesting that my body is urging me to eat more here or less here, or is more hungry here, or has a hyper focus on food there. I suggest everybody having a food journal with them during this time, just to write down observations of what's coming up for you in this process. And just a final note, anytime that you do something different, your brain will switch into homeostasis mode. Your brain is going to switch into a mode where it says, I don't like this change. I don't like this shift. What's going on here? And so it's going to bring up alert and some heightened awareness of things. That's not a bad thing. It's just your brain protecting you from change. So as you start to think more thoughts about food, or as you start to notice your stomach grumbling because you might be a little bit more hungry, you don't have to jump to the conclusion that this thing that you're doing is bad for you. What you want to do is become the observer. Does it create negative emotions? Does it have a prolonged effect on your emotions and your behaviors? You want to ask yourself these questions and not make automatic assumptions based on what you've read or what you've heard or what your friend experienced. You really want to understand it from your own unique individual experience. I hope that's helpful for you. If you want to know more about how to change your habits from the inside out and understand your own relationship to food, how to change your relationship to food, and how to create permanent change, permanent weight loss in your life through non-restrictive and non-diet methods, reach out to me. I'm sure all of my information will be in the communication that you got from Keon, and I'd love to hear from you.